he actually said we'll go in on the weekend, and we went on Friday and came out Monday, and we had all the songs ready to go.
He was the scream that set stadiums on fire. The raw, sandpaper howl that tore through the silence and made rock feel dangerous again. But one night, in February 1980, that voice was found dead in a car, and ACDC, the loudest, hardest-hitting band in the world, was suddenly voiceless. Bon Scott was gone. To the world, it looked like the end. How do you replace lightning in a bottle? How does a band built on one man's swagger, defiance, and snarl survive when that man is buried in the dirt? But that's where the myth begins to crack. Because AC/DC didn't just survive. They roared back louder, harder, and bigger than ever before. They climbed out of the ashes with Back in Black, an album dripping with death, tribute, and sheer bloody-minded willpower. But what did it cost them? Was it resilience? Or was it denial? Behind the black amps and devil horns lies a story most fans never hear. The guilt, the industry pressure, the ghost of Bon that never left, and a new voice, Brian Johnson, thrust into an impossible role. Replace a legend or see the band die. This is not just a story of death and rebirth. It's a story of identity, of grief that was buried, not healed, and of a band that spent decades trying to outrun a shadow that grew darker with every encore. Because when your rise is born in tragedy, your legacy is forever haunted by what might have been. Tonight, we're telling the story they tried to bury. Welcome to Shadows of Rock, where legends live loud, even in silence. We tell the untold stories, the hidden struggles, and the raw truth behind the icons who shaped rock history. This is Shadows of Rock. The light fades, the music never does. Chapter 1. Thunder Without Warning. February 19th, 1980. London was soaked in a winter rain, the kind that crawled into your bones. Bon Scott, 33 years old, was slumped in the front seat of a friend's car, lifeless. Hours earlier he had been drinking, heavily, chaotically, like he always did. But this time, he never woke up. No smashed hotel room, no fiery crash, just silence. A quiet end to rock's loudest voice. Bon had always lived fast. Too fast. He wore danger like a leather jacket, tight, loud, and impossible to ignore. Fronting AC/DC, he wasn't just the singer. He was the fire, the sneer, the wink behind every electric riff. With his death, the band lost more than a frontman. They lost their identity. Inside the band, grief struck like a sudden punch. Angus and Malcolm Young, the brothers who had built AC/DC from gritty pub gigs in Sydney to headlining Europe, were stunned. They didn't speak publicly. They didn't know what to say. There were no rehearsals, no meetings, just numbness. The press circled like vultures. Was this the end? How could it not be? But behind closed doors, something strange happened. The band didn't implode. Not yet. Instead, Malcolm picked up his guitar. Angus plugged into his amp. They didn't talk about it, but they started writing. The music kept coming. Louder, darker, rawer than before. It was like Bon's ghost had entered the room, screaming, "Don't stop now, boys!" What the world didn't know was that Bon had already been pushing them to record a new album. He'd scribbled lyrics on napkins, hummed melodies between drinks, dared them to go bigger. That energy lingered in the studio. Every chord struck during those first sessions after his death felt like both a tribute and a defiance. Yet no one said it out loud. They didn't talk about pain. They didn't cry. Not in public. They were Australians, rockers, men. And men didn't mourn. They plugged in and played. But under the distortion and drive, cracks were forming. Malcolm was retreating inward, Angus hid behind his schoolboy persona, and the world was about to learn what happens when you try to replace the irreplaceable. The thunder had struck without warning, and ACDC stood in the wreckage, half in shadow, half in flame. Chapter 2. A Voice from the Ashes. He was a mechanic, a Geordie with a flat cap and a throat like broken glass. Brian Johnson had never dreamed of joining one of the biggest rock bands on the planet. At 32, he was still gigging with his band Geordie, changing car tires by day and belting bluesy choruses at smoky clubs by night. Then the phone rang. At first he thought it was a prank. ACDC? Looking for him? But it was real. They flew him out. No frills, no red carpet, just a quiet studio, a mic, and the heaviest grief hanging in the air. Brian didn't try to imitate Bon. He couldn't. No one could. Instead, he screamed from the gut, raw, desperate, defiant. It wasn't polish they wanted. It was power. And Brian had it. But inside, he was terrified. How do you walk into the shoes of a man the world wasn't ready to lose? How do you sing songs for a band whose heart had just stopped beating? The band didn't talk about Bon. Not directly. The pain was too fresh, too sacred. But his absence screamed louder than any amp. The pressure was enormous. Fans were skeptical. Critics were waiting. Even Brian doubted himself. But Malcolm and Angus knew something. ACDC couldn't die in the dark. They needed a resurrection. And in Brian's howl, they heard thunder again. They locked themselves in Compass Point Studios in the Bahamas. Surrounded by hurricanes, sweat, and grief, they began to build Back in Black. A tribute, yes, but also a dare. A challenge to death itself. Brian poured his voice into every line. It wasn't just music. It was survival. Songs like Hell's Bells and Shoot to Thrill weren't just catchy. They were war cries, echoes of a band clawing its way out of a grave. And then came the title track, Back in Black. A song written for Bon, a riff that never died, a chorus that exploded through the speakers like a resurrection spell. They weren't just back, they were unstoppable. But under the bravado, the wound still bled. Brian was now the voice of a band haunted by its past, and no matter how loud he screamed, Bon's shadow always loomed. They had found a new voice, but the question lingered. Was it theirs? Chapter 3. The Gospel of Survival. Back in Black didn't just succeed, it detonated. Released in July 1980, barely 5 months after Bon's death, it didn't mourn, it roared. With that opening bell toll of Hell's Bells, ACDC announced to the world they weren't here to fade, they were here to conquer. The numbers were staggering. It sold millions within weeks. Radio couldn't get enough. MTV, barely launched, latched onto the band's high-voltage aesthetic. By decade's end, Back in Black had become one of the best-selling albums in history. It still is. But behind the platinum plaques and deafening crowds, something went unresolved. ACDC had won the battle. But what about the war inside? For Brian Johnson, every standing ovation came with a whisper. You're not Bon. Fans screamed his name. But some still wore Bon's image on their shirts. He was walking in the footprints of a ghost, and no matter how well he filled the role, he could never erase the past. The young brothers pressed forward like soldiers. Malcolm, especially, grew quieter. The driving force behind the band's rhythm section, he treated success like a job, not a joyride. Interviews became sparse. Emotions, even more so. They were focused. Almost too focused, as if staying loud meant never having to stop and feel. ACDC became a machine. Tour, record, repeat. And for a while that rhythm worked. But what the public didn't see was the emotional toll. The band rarely acknowledged Bon in interviews, not out of disrespect, but out of pain. Malcolm once said, "You don't need to talk about Bond to know he's there." They kept his memory locked inside the music, letting the riffs speak the words they couldn't. That silence created distance between the band and the fans, between the past and the present. ACDC wasn't just evolving, it was surviving. Barely. Their sound didn't shift with the trends, they didn't chase radio, they chased consistency. Some called it stubborn, others called it heroic. But for ACDC, it was gospel. You don't change the formula when it's written in blood. Still, every note carried weight. Every encore echoed with the man who wasn't there. They had survived the unthinkable. But survival doesn't always mean healing. And as the 80s rolled on, the cracks began to widen. Chapter 4. The Echo Chamber. By the mid-1980s, ACDC had climbed the mountain. But they weren't looking down. They were looking over their shoulder. Back in Black had made them immortal. But what happens after immortality? Their follow-up albums, For Those About to Rock and Flick of the Switch, kept the flame alive, but the fire flickered. Sales dipped. Critics called them stagnant. Some said they were a band stuck in time, replaying the same chords like a scratched vinyl. But for ACDC, repetition wasn't laziness. It was ritual. They weren't trying to be fashionable. They were trying to stay true. To themselves, to Bond, to the idea that rock shouldn't follow, it should lead. But here's the paradox. In staying true, they began to vanish from the spotlight. In 1988, ACDC released Blow Up Your Video. It sold well. The tour was massive. But backstage, the real explosion was silent. Malcolm Young, stone-faced, steady as a trained Malcolm, was quietly falling apart. The man who never missed a beat had developed a secret drinking habit that rivaled Bond's in the end, and it almost killed him. Malcolm didn't spiral in public. He faded quietly. He missed shows, lost weight, forgot lyrics, until one day he told his bandmates he needed help and walked away to get sober. It was the first time ACDC had ever admitted something was broken. For fans, Malcolm's departure was a crack in the armor. This was the guy who never bent, never blinked. If he could fall, who else might be next? They brought in nephew Stevie Young to keep the tour going, and in typical ACDC fashion, they said little. No press conferences, no breakdowns, just volume. But the echo chamber had formed. They were playing louder, but listening less. The music was still explosive, but the soul was hollowing out. Brian Johnson felt it. He once said in an interview, "I always thought I was borrowing Bond's mic stand." Decades after joining the band, Brian still didn't feel like he owned the voice. It haunted him, inspired him, but it also made him feel like a placeholder in someone else's story. And so the band kept marching, show after show, album after album. They didn't evolve, they endured, but endurance comes at a price. And soon the band would face another silence, one even louder than Bond's. Chapter 5. When the music stops. It happened in a flash, then unraveled over years. In 2004, rumors started swirling. Something was wrong. ACDC was pulling out of studio sessions. Tour plans were put on hold. Whispers grew louder. Was Malcolm Young okay? The truth hit like a brick. Malcolm, co-founder, rhythm guitarist, the anchor of it all, had been diagnosed with dementia. The kind that steals not just memory, but identity. The man who once drove the engine of ACDC with relentless precision could no longer remember the chords he helped invent. For decades, Malcolm had been the band's spine. Angus may have worn the schoolboy uniform, but Malcolm held the soul of the band in his calloused hands. And now, that soul was slipping away. The band released a quiet statement. Malcolm is taking a break due to health issues, but fans knew this wasn't a break. It was goodbye. The silence around it echoed the past, just as they never fully mourned Bon. They never truly addressed Malcolm's decline. It was too painful, too real. So they did what they always did. They carried on. Rock or Bust came out in 2014 with Stevie Young stepping in for his uncle. The title sounded like a mission statement. The music still roared, but something had changed. The foundation felt thinner. The riffs had energy, but not memory. And then came another blow. Brian Johnson, the voice that rebuilt ACDC from Bon's ashes, was forced to step away mid-tour in 2016 due to severe hearing loss. Doctors warned that continuing could result in permanent deafness. The band, already bleeding from Malcolm's absence, was now without its frontman. To fans, it felt like the walls were caving in, the rhythm gone, the voice silenced. Was this finally the end? But ACDC did something no one expected. They called Axl Rose. It was a decision that divided the rock world. Some called it sacrilege. Others admired the audacity. But in that moment, it wasn't about purity. It was about finishing what they started. Axl stepped in. The tour finished. The amps stayed hot. But inside, ACDC was running on memory and fumes. Malcolm passed away in 2017, quietly. No dramatic headlines, just a single devastating loss. And through it all, the question pulsed beneath every downbeat. How long can a band outrun its own ghosts? Chapter 6. Resurrected by fire. Most bands would have faded. After losing Bon, Malcolm, and Brian, after facing grief, addiction, deafness, and death, most would have stepped off the stage, bowed to the silence, and let the legend rest. But not ACDC. In 2020, when the world was already paralyzed by a pandemic and live music had gone mute, a shockwave ripped through rock radio. ACDC is back, not just back, but whole. Brian Johnson had returned. With new experimental hearing technology, he could sing again without risking total deafness. Cliff Williams, the longtime bassist who had retired in 2016, came back. Phil Rudd, the thunder behind their classic sound, who had been sidelined due to legal issues and personal struggles, returned to the kit. Stevie Young remained on rhythm guitar, playing with the stoic fire Malcolm had taught him. And then there was Power Up. Released in November 2020, it wasn't just an album, it was a resurrection. A love letter to Malcolm, his unused riffs, sketches, and ideas built into every track. He was gone, but his hands were on every note. Tracks like Shot in the Dark and Through the Mists of Time weren't just new songs, they were echoes. They pulsed with grief, gratitude, and stubborn, defiant joy. It was the sound of a band that refused to die. In the liner notes, Angus wrote simply, "This is for Malcolm." And fans felt it. They didn't just hear ACDC, they felt Malcolm's rhythm like a heartbeat under every chord. Even in death, he was driving the train. Power Up topped charts in over 20 countries. Critics hailed it not as a return to form, but as proof that form had never left. ACDC wasn't evolving. They were enduring, yes, but also honoring. For Brian Johnson, it was more than a comeback. It was redemption. He had feared his journey would end with silence. Instead, he returned to the mic like a man reborn. He later said, "It felt like the old gang was back together. And Malcolm was in the room." It didn't matter that they were now in their 60s and 70s, that stadiums had been shut down, that most of their peers had long since retired or fallen. ACDC proved something rare. You don't have to reinvent yourself when you've already become timeless. But legacy is a fragile thing. And with Malcolm gone and time closing in, the final curtain began to feel nearer than ever. Chapter 7. The price of never stopping. Beneath every power chord and explosive chorus, ACDC carried something few could see. The weight of never stopping. For over 4 decades, they had survived what would have buried most. But survival, when it becomes identity, doesn't always allow for rest. It demands motion. It demands noise. And somewhere along the way, the band became less about living and more about lasting. Brian Johnson once described it like this: "We were on a train that never slowed down. You just held on and hoped the tracks were still there." But even iron rails can bend. Tour after tour, album after album, ACDC pushed forward while their bodies aged, their losses mounted, and the world around them changed. They didn't chase trends, they ignored them. Grunge rose and fell. New metal came and went. Synth pop, indie rock, EDM, none of it changed their formula. They kept playing like it was still 1980. For fans, this was sacred. A promise that not everything had to change, that in a world of chaos, at least ACDC would stay loud, steady, and familiar. But behind the amps, it wasn't easy. Brian's hearing issues weren't a fluke. They were a result of decades of decibels. Phil Rudd's legal battles and substance issues had pushed him to the edge. Malcolm's illness had gutted the band at its core. Cliff Williams had stepped away not from exhaustion, but from heartbreak. The machine still ran, but it rattled more with each mile. They were men in their 70s, still playing like 20-year-olds. The shows were tight, the sound was sharp, but the toll, physical, emotional, spiritual, was undeniable. In interviews, Angus grew more introspective. "It's not about being the biggest band in the world anymore. It's about playing for the people who stuck with us." But even that came with a shadow. Because for all their success, ACDC was haunted by the idea that stopping would mean disappearing, that slowing down would betray what they'd built, what Bon had died for, what Malcolm had sweated for. So they kept going until they couldn't. Their most recent tour plans remain uncertain. Age, loss, and the global pause of the pandemic have cast long shadows, and while the band hasn't officially announced a final goodbye, the silence is growing. Still, they've never needed words. AC/DC's story was always written in volume, in rhythm, in sweat, but now, as the final chords echo and the spotlight fades, one question lingers: how long can even thunder roll? Chapter 8. Legacy. What we keep, what we lose. AC/DC's legacy is carved not just in gold records, but in resilience. They weren't the most complex band. They didn't write symphonies. They never needed to. What they offered was purity, unapologetic power, a refusal to bow, bend, or be broken. But that same refusal came with a cost. They outlived their origin. They buried their brothers. They grieved in silence and played through pain, and in doing so, they became more than a band. They became a myth, an engine that wouldn't quit. Yet beneath the roar, they were men, flawed, wounded, searching for something beyond the next stage light. Bon Scott was never truly replaced. Brian Johnson didn't try to be Bon. He tried to honor him. And for decades, he did just that, carrying the weight of a ghost with dignity and grit. Malcolm Young was the quiet architect, the unshakable heart. And when that heart finally gave out, the band didn't replace him. They remembered him, built an album on his riffs, played in his honor, and let his spirit keep time. Phil Rudd, Cliff Williams, Brian Johnson, all walked through personal hells and came back, not because of ego, but because of love. Love for the music, for each other, for the fans who stood in the rain for hours just to hear one more Thunderstruck note. And Angus, he kept the schoolboy uniform on even as the years added weight to his shoulders, not out of gimmick, but out of ritual, a symbol, A promise that as long as that uniform appeared on stage, rock and roll was still alive. But the real legacy of AC/DC isn't just in decibels, it's in defiance. The kind that says grief won't have the final word. That music can outlive the man. That even when the voice is lost, the song can still rise. They taught us something uncomfortable, that we often expect our idols to never change, to stay loud, to stay young, to carry our nostalgia on their backs until it breaks them. And still, they never drop the weight. What do we do to our legends when they refuse to die? We turn them into thunder, and we listen, even after the storm. The lights go down, the crowd fades. But in the silence that follows, something lingers. Not just sound, not just memory, legacy. AC/DC never set out to be immortal. They didn't chase image. They didn't court controversy. They simply plugged in and played louder than anyone thought possible. And when death came knocking, they didn't retreat. They turned up the volume. That's what makes their story so different. It's not just about music. It's about refusal, about loss, and what comes after, about the price of never letting go. Because in their refusal to quit, AC/DC gave us something rare, a band that didn't just burn bright, they endured. Through every heartbreak, every headline, every ghost. And yet, maybe the most powerful thing they gave us is the silence that follows, because that silence, it reminds us of what we've lost, of what they lost, and of what we, as fans, demand from the artists we claim to love. We want our legends forever, but legends are human, and humans break. So tonight, as the final bell tolls, we honor not just Bon or Malcolm or the riffs that made our hearts race. We honor the will to keep playing, even when the stage is empty, even when the voice is gone, even when the lights won't come back on. This was the story of how AC/DC lost their voice and refused to die. What's your favorite AC/DC memory? Was it Bon's wild snarl or Brian's gritty growl? The opening bell of Hell's Bells or the fury of Thunderstruck? Tell us in the comments below. Because the story of AC/DC isn't just theirs, it's ours too. And if this story moved you, wait until you see how Kurt Cobain's final days followed a hauntingly similar path. Tap here to watch. How Led Zeppelin conquered the world and nearly destroyed themselves.